In today's video, we are going to be giving a bit of a service to a Shimano rear derailleur. This one is an XT that has some gunked up guide wheels on here, a bit of a sticky clutch and a slightly creaky mounting bolt. So we're going to fix all of these problems. Okay, so it's hardly surprising your rear derailleur will give you a bit of stick every now and then. Look at where it's mounted on the bike. It's in the direct firing line for both rocks and strikes, undergrowth, and of course all the crap that comes off your wheels from mud and rocks and stuff in the terrain. So the natural thing that you should be cleaning from time to time anyway are the guide wheels, often known as jockey wheels. Basically these two wheels on this cage of the derailleur here. These get covered in black gunk, and unsurprisingly the bearings themselves get shot here and there. So sometimes it's easier to just replace them, but I'm not going to do that with these because they feel alright, they're just filthy. Now, a few other things that can have effects on your derailleur, this is the same with any, are the mounting bolt. Generally, you'll notice nothing happens to this, but I have had it before riding in very dry conditions in different countries where this has creaked, where it's actually got really dry. So we're going to remove that, put some fresh grease on there, and we're going to look at the clutch itself. Now the clutch, of course, you can turn them on and off, and they work exceptionally well. They work brilliant, do a great job. But if yours has been sticking, maybe not returning properly, getting a bit of baggy chain at the bottom, then you need to put a bit of fresh grease on your clutch, but it's very important where you put it. So let's get this thing taken apart, shall we? Okay, so I'm going to try and do this as close to real time as possible. I've got another camera just over my head here, so I might be looking up from time to time, all right? So I've got my derailleur here. I've got an internal hub grease. Shimano do recommend this particular one that's on screen, but you can't get it everywhere. So something lithium based will do the trick. This one is designed for pretty much a similar thing. So we're going to use that along with some Shimano grease on those guide wheels, and you'll need some thread lock for a couple of bits and pieces. Now, first things first is to make sure the clutch is turned off. We're going to remove the clutch cover on the derailleur first. So that's a 2mm. There's 3 bolts holding it in place. So undo those 3 bolts and put them to the side. Now, there's not too many parts that you can confuse on one of these derailleurs, so you don't have to worry about messing it up. But I'm still going to keep the parts all separate here just so you can see them all. Actually, it's quite sticky, these bolts. It feels like this has been cleaned a lot, but not necessarily properly cleaned. I can see the insides of the workings on this are actually quite filthy. Now, if you had a parts washer, I'd recommend doing that. But I haven't, so we're just going to take it apart. Okay. Right, so the 3 bolts are off, and now you remove the plastic cover. Nice and carefully there. Now underneath there's also a little rubber seal, like a rubber grommet, so carefully lift that out and put that next to it, and you'll see it's actually shaped, so you make sure you put it back in the correct orientation. Now this part is the clutch here, okay, so you've got the roller clutch and you've got a tension band that goes around the outside that's basically held in place or tightened onto the actual clutch itself with the lever. As you can see here, if I carefully turn it on, you can see it actually adds a bit of friction here, and then this turns it off. So you can actually watch the clutch moving around. There you go, loads of friction. Okay, so first things first, remove the 2mm bolts at the bottom here, or at least loosen it. I'm going to loosen it on this one. Now you should be able to lift the clutch straight off, all of it together there. Okay, so clutch into 2 pieces, so that's just your adjuster for that, for the tension band, and then you have the tension band and the clutch unit. We'll have a closer look at that when we actually go to clean that, but I'm just going to cast that aside, and we'll fully take everything apart so we can clean it all individually and put it back together. Now the next thing I want to remove will be the actual main cage of the Mech. So inside this part is the spring, so this is still a derailleur now, but there's obviously no clutch basically slowing this motion down, so it's kind of like an old derailleur really. Now, something important to say is the spring is incredibly strong. Now, there is a little pin here to stop the derailleur, the bottom cage, spinning around. We have to remove that and then allow the cage to spin around to take the tension off it in order to remove it safely. So just take care, because it can sort of spring around and trap your fingers. So I'm just going to remove that now. Now, this pin will definitely need some thread lock when you put it back together. Okay, so that is out. Now, as you see, it stops on the actual back of the derailleur here, But I'm going to move this and allow the cage to move all the way around. There we go. And so now there is no tension on that at all. So that is ideal for removing. So you need a Torx key, T25 in the back here, and a 4mm on this side. Now, something very important to say, I'm going to emphasize this a couple of times in the video. This part that I'm about to remove, you can only put grease on one part of it. You only want to grease the part that goes into the sprung part of the derailleur. This post on the outside that the clutch sits on should not have any grease on it. That's really important. The whole point of the clutch is it uses friction. If you put grease on here, that I have seen in some tutorials online, the clutch can slip and it won't do its job properly. Now, Shimano specifically stipulate this in their manual. They say in the service manual, that is, to not have grease on here, only to have grease on this part, okay? Remember that, not on this outside post, because that's where the clutch sits on, and it needs to have friction, otherwise it won't work, it won't do its job properly. There is another part that you should grease, and I'm going to show you that in a bit more detail when we get there. Okay, so this should just slide off now, and that is your two parts of the derailleur. The parallelogram and your lower cage, sometimes called the plates. I think the proper name is in the manual. So I'm just going to remove that spring. Now, the spring part itself doesn't really need any maintenance, it's just a spring, but a bit of a clean won't do it any harm. And I'm actually going to put a little bit of grease over it, not for any lubrication purposes, it's more like treating it like packing grease, just to make sure it can't get any corrosion on the inside there, just a small amount. Okay, so next part of the process is to remove these guide wheels, jockey wheels, whatever you want to call them. Everyone seems to have a different name. Okay, so 3mm Allen key in the back here. Now, depending on what model it is, you might have an E-clip holding yours in place, in which case you have to remove that carefully. These ones don't. Just have the Allen head there. Just going to move my Allen keys out of the way. So there's your first one out. Now, depending on the model of your derailleur, the XTRs have directional guide wheels on those, so make sure that if yours is directional, you put it back in the correct way. Just going to lay those down on the top there. Feels a bit weird talking to two cameras at once, and I've got a screen above that one as well. Okay. Again, make sure you note down the orientation of these things. Now, these wheels, as you can see, this is a perfect example of one that's been gunked up by actually dry conditions, but they get really bad. So you have these little plates that sit on top of the bearings here, and this one actually has a load of grass around this. They kind of get raveled around as you ride. So look at that, this all adds friction, this all nasty stuff. So what you want to be doing is removing, I mean, I'm using a pick on these because it's actually dry. Removing all this stuff like a dentist does with getting a plaque off your teeth. Basically it's the same, except it's equally as disgusting as plaque, isn't it? And once you've done that, then you want to remove the bearing seals. I'm going to clean these out a bit first because I don't want to get any of this into the bearings. So let's just do that first, shall we? Okay, so at this point, you definitely want to be starting to clean things up a bit. So I'm going to do these jockey wheels now before I move on any further. I don't have to come back to that. So I'm just going to use a bit of disc brake cleaner. If yours are completely filthy, you might want to get more involved with some other product, but a bit of disc brake cleaner on a rag would actually get the worst off a lot of this stuff straight out. Yeah, so it's just encrusted stuff, it's nothing crazy on here, but yours might be way worse than this. So give everything a good clean down, make sure there's no scummy bits laying around. Okay, so as I was saying, just get in with that fine pick or scraper and really get the nasty stuff off. Now these ones are actually it's all dried on stuff, so I think I'm going to be able to clean it up with disc brake cleaner quite well. But you might find you need to completely degrease yours. If you do, take care to not get any degreaser near the actual bearings themselves until you've inspected them and decided that it might need it. You know, if there's just a bit of grease in there, it's a bit dirty, you can get away with just purging through some fresh grease. If you're gonna have a full degrease, then you're gonna need to really get to work on it. As I say, these ones feel smooth, they're just visually grubby, so I'm just gonna finish taking off all of this nasty stuff. God, it is horrible. No wonder your gears get a bit noisy at times. All this excess gunk being spun around inside your chain. Surprisingly stubborn as well. And it's weird how this stuff, no matter where you ride, it could be the cleanest ride in the world, and you will always have this stuff just appear. Okay, now something to just pay attention to with these guide and pulley wheels, jockey wheels, whatever you want to call them, is that they are slightly different and they do have a direction. Now, if you look up close, you will see the directional arrows on this one here, and you will also see it says G pulley. That means it's the guide pulley. So that is the upper wheel, and the tension pulley is the lower wheel. And again, it should say on it, yeah, T pulley, there you go, and it will have a direction as well. Can't see an arrow on that side. And there's an arrow there. Okay, so we've got the direction for those. Now I'm just gonna flip the covers off, and I'm actually gonna treat these to a bit of fresh grease, because these ones are actually in really good condition and I can just make them last a bit longer. If yours are feeling a little bit ropey, you're best off just getting a fresh set, to be honest. They don't cost a lot of money, and they will definitely improve your shifting compared to ones that feel notchy and stuff. They can also make your chain come off as well when you're backpedaling. If they stop rotating, basically the chain can actually skip off and get jammed in the cage. So I'm just very carefully going to lift the bearing covers off using this pick. He says, there we go. And actually they're pretty clean in there. They are looking good. You can just move the bearing race around and you can see, in fact, how good this one is. So these ones are actually in pretty good condition, and there is still some original grease in there. It's just not much, which suggests it's probably been washed out. Now I've just taken off the cover of the other side, and I'm actually just going to purge some fresh grease through. Now, grease gun does make this much easier because you can quite literally force the grease out the other side, and you know that you're getting a good amount in there. As I say, this one is a Shimano dedicated grease, but you can use any quality grease in the bearings. And then I'm just gonna smooth some of that into place in there. Get my trusty rag, reuse that bit in a minute. And then put the first cover back in place. Now, always be super careful with bearing covers. They've got to be seated correctly in. They can add friction, and of course, if they're not in place, gunk and stuff's going to get inside instead, which means you're back to square one, having to do this job all over again. Okay, so this one is in. As you can see, there's quite a bit of grease that's purged out the other side, which is good now. That means it's completely full. So I'm just going to put the other cover back in place, and there we go. That looks good to me. One more wipe over. I don't want any excess grease on the outside of these wheels because lots of gunk sticks to them. And then that one can go to the side and be ready for reinstallation shortly. Okay, next thing to clean then and work out is the actual main part of the derailleur, so the upper parallelogram part of it. Now, I'm actually going to get this wet basically and use some bike cleaner on this to get it completely clean. But before I do that, I'm just going to remove that pivot bolt. So at the top you have, it's usually a 5mm. Now there's normally a little C-clip or an E-clip holding these in place, but I have noticed that this one must have taken a hit because there isn't one. So this is actually just going to come straight out. Now, as I said, this one you rarely need to do anything with, but if you slide this out, you see it is a little bit gunky in there, but if yours is bone dry, then this is just the sort of component that's going to get really, well, creaky basically. So give that a good clean and a grease and put it back together. But before we do that, I'm actually going to clean the rest of the body here to make it look nice and good on the inside. So it does look pretty dusty at the moment, so it's not going to be helping it, is it? Okay, so the main body of the Mech is nice and clean now. The cages are clean, the wheels are clean, they're re-greased as well, so just got to do all the pins and stuff. Now, when cleaning the clutch itself, try and avoid getting anything in it. You don't want to get any degrease on the inside of the clutch, and you want to just be kind of careful how you do this. So if you look carefully, you've got the tension band that goes around it. All you need is a flat screwdriver just to carefully whittle, just to open it up a touch. and you can slide out the actual roller clutch unit. Now you do not want to get any grease on the inside of this. Okay, so that is the roller clutch. The whole point of this is that it has friction against this pin here. So you do not want to have any grease on this surface and any grease on the inside of the clutch. And of course, you want to avoid any degrease or grease and stuff getting into the actual inner workings as well, because they're going to mess it up. The only bit that you should grease is the very outside where that tension band sits onto it, okay? So one more thing to say about the clutch unit itself. These are fully replaceable. You get a kit that comes with a tension band with the clutch and the little cam adjuster for it. Now, if your one has any corrosion on it, you could arguably sand it away using some very fine emery paper, but to be honest, you're better off just getting a fresh clutch. To get one of these parts, you actually need to go to one of your dealers. It's not something that they just list on the Shimano website, but it's very easy to get hold of for your local bike shop. So I would recommend, if there's any corrosion, getting a fresh one in there, and your derailleur will work just as well as it did when it's new. But this one is absolutely fine, just needs a little bit of care. Okay, so everything is cleaned up now. Pretty much time to sort of grease and put things back together in reverse order. So going to grease the pivot first, get that into place. Then we're going to reassemble the cage and the plates, basically put that back on with that spring mechanism, get it into place. The last thing we're doing is the clutch. So we're going to go super close in on that just to make sure you can understand again where the grease goes. It's really important. Okay, so I'm just going to put a small amount of Shimano grease on here. You can use whatever you want. I've got Shimano grease in my grease gun, so it makes perfect sense for me to use that. And of course, as with using any grease, just make sure that you clean up any residue. You don't want any excess grease or oil on anything, just because contributes to wear. If your one has the clip, I would definitely put it on. This one is long gone. I don't know if this derailleur has been used for something else, but it's not that big a problem. It's just designed to keep it all together when you take the derailleur off the bike. But there we go, that is good. Okay, no problem at all there. Right, now time for the lower cage. Again, the crucial thing to remember with this is the orientation of those guide wheels. Again, so you've got tension pulley and guide pulley. Remember, the guide one is the top one, the tension pulley is the lower one, because that's the tensioning part of the derailleur. Okay, so time to get the cage back together now at the bottom. Now I'm using a tiny bit of blue thread lock, although it does look like it did come with red on there. I prefer to use blue because of the fact these are only little 3mm bolts, and it really wouldn't take much to accidentally round them out. So do take care of that. So let's get that lower one in first. Get that in place. Not gonna nip it up until I got the top one in place. So just, again, make sure the orientation is correct. Tiny bit of blue thread lock on that one as well. Oh, of course it goes from the other side. My bad. That time of day, I guess. As of anything like this, check at every stage. Okay, so bottom one and top one complete. So that is the cage system back together. Wheels spinning. I mean, to be fair, they were spinning pretty good to start with, but they're a tiny bit slower, but that's great because they've got loads of good grease in there, so great for the crap British riding weather we have. Again, I'm going to give this a full clean before I put it back on the bike. It's had a good enough clean so far. Okay, now it's just as simple as getting the spring back in place. So a little bit of grease in that spring cavity there. Now just make sure that the little plastic spacer sits on the bottom of the spring correctly. I'm just going to be putting a little bit of grease on the spring itself. It's not to aid its performance, it's literally just for a little help against corrosion. Okay, and then what we want to be doing is getting the hooked end and hook it into the back plate. And it just goes in there. Okay, now this bit takes a bit of doing in one hit, so there's a few things to prepare. So that is your pin, that's your main pivot, so I'm going to put a little bit of grease on this now. And then I'm going to line up the spring in the cavity there. in the back, and the same with the little plastic spacer. Then whilst holding this together, just slide that derailleur pivot pin into place and secure that with that 4mm. Make sure it sits home. Yeah, there we go. Now make sure everything lines up just before you fully tighten that. Should be fairly self-explanatory. Now as you'll see, it's sprung, but there's no tension here. So to get the tension on this correct, bear in mind that you're going to need that pin to go back in, the stopper pin. Manipulate the cage out slightly like this, and then you need to go all the way around the clock with the lower cage. So lower cage round, and then it's back in place, and then you hold it there with that pin. So you need that one back in here. Bit of thread lock in that thread. In fact, and you need your crosshead screwdriver. Okay, with that now in place, that pin can stop the derailleur from deflecting, okay? So it's quite a tricky maneuver. You've got to basically make it go all the way around the world, yeah, and then you're using that pin to hold it in place. So that is basically correct now. As you can see, the upper cage works nice and freely on its own there. And then of course the lower sprung cage is sprung as it should be. Now all that's left to do is to make sure you get that clutch back in correctly. Now this bit, again, is just as important as all the other steps. In fact, it is the most important step, because if you get the grease in the wrong place here, it's not going to perform as it should do. Now just to emphasize the point, you do not want to have grease on the actual main pivot. So just to make sure that's nice and clean there, but no grease. But you do want to have some grease on the outside of the clutch, okay? Now this is where I'm going to use this free hub body grease. Now if you've got the correct Shimano one, all the better, but some of this stuff will do fine, or some lithium grease is designed for high temperature, and then happy days. You want to get a very small amount. I'm just going to use the end of a screwdriver actually. It's literally all you need. And then you want to get the band back in place on the outside. So note the orientation of the band. You have a smaller side and a bigger side. The smaller side goes at the bottom. Okay, so this can be a little tricky just to get these in place. Same thing applies. Very carefully use a screwdriver just to prise it apart. And then clear up any excess grease. You do not want grease to get inside the clutch itself. Okay. Okay, so clutch ready to be put back into the derailleur. Now your last little thing that you've got to do here is a kind of an all-in-one maneuver. So just check the orientation is correct of the actual clutch there. Now note the shape on the cam there. So the cam lever itself is like an oblong or rectangle shape. It's got to correlate, and you kind of need to put this all in one go. So if you just look in closely here, you see I'm actually going to line up the flat post on the cam. Got to make sure that the clutch is off at this stage. It can be a little bit of a fiddle here, but it's best to get it all in one hit. And there we go. Okay, so something very important is just to make sure when you seat the clutch down that there is no gap. It's really important, because otherwise the cover won't be able to sit on completely and be watertight, and you do need that, because otherwise that's how it is corroded, it gets sticky in the first place. Just want to emphasize the point one more time. Only grease on the outside of the actual clutch unit, the roller clutch, where the tension band goes around it. No oil or no grease on the inside of it or on the actual post that it sits on. Okay, it relies on that friction. So this is suitably in place now. Just going to make sure that that bolt is nipped. There we go, and you can see the clutch working there. Right, let's zoom you in so you can see that. Okay, now finally the last thing to do is to get the little rubber grommet on and get the cover on, and then that is a rear derailleur fully serviced with the clutch nicely serviced. Of course, along the way, if there are any parts of this that are broken, for example, that don't work, you know, if the bearings are shot, I did say replace those guide wheels, and the same, if your clutch is knackered, replace that. Now you've got to just make sure that this sits very neatly over the edge. There we go. I'm just going to make a fully watertight seal. Get those last bolts in place. The gloves are actually a bit slidey from all the grease on them now, but kept the grease off my hands at least. Okay, well that's it, job done. That is how you service your Shimano rear derailleur. Make sure the clutch is working nicely and get those jockey and pulley guide wheels working as they should be. It's not a hard thing to do, and it will genuinely make your rear derailleur feel great. Now, something just to add before putting back on your bike, something that's great to do if you have removed it from your bike to do this, soak those pivots in a nice bit of wet lube. Wipe off any excess once it's fully soaked in, and then reinstall onto your bike, and it'll work a dream. I'm just going to show you that up close there nicely. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? Looks loads better than it did a bit earlier anyway. Well, there we go. That's the end of this week's maintenance video. Hopefully you found this helpful, and hopefully if you had a sticky clutch, you no longer have one. Let us know what you thought in those comments underneath, and give us any suggestions for fixing more bike stuff. See you later.